My name is Chris. I work at a mobile gaming company called Kabam in the States. The subject of my talk is to give you some insight in terms of our cross-continent perspective, but I feel like this is a subtext for a bigger topic that we've been hearing a lot about here in this conference, which is kind of the state of the union of mobile gaming. And our theory, my theory, is that we are, to use a historical reference, we're in the middle of the second phase of our industry, which I will call the Industrial Revolution. We started with the Renaissance period, which started with the advent of the App Store, and I would argue ended somewhere in the middle of 2013, and we've been in this Industrial Revolution period for about 2 years. Now, a lot of the data that you've been hearing about the last couple days has been some harsh reality. I would argue that, as we saw in the Industrial Revolution, that while there was harsh reality, there was also a golden age of innovation. And I would argue that that is one of the characteristics that will continue to define this market and continue to drive its growth is, and many of you in this room are going to be doing that, is driving the innovation, and we hope to be doing that as well. What the future phases are, we can talk about that in 5 years, whether it's singularity, whether it's post-apocalyptic, who knows? But hopefully we see nothing but positive in the future. Sorry that I have to look back here. There's a blue screen here. So here's a little bit about us. I'll click through all the boring information. We started as a gaming company in 2009. It was the third iteration of the company's being. Started in web, moved over to mobile right at the tail end of that Renaissance period. And had seen some early success. Great, thank you. We have some great investors from all over the world, including most recently a company called Alibaba in China that has driven a lot of our thinking around this cross-continent perspective with a specific focus on Asia. So this is some of our footprint here. You'll see we have locations all around the world, including a significant presence in the EU through our office in Berlin. We have game development studios. Our first one was, ironically, in Beijing that has historically only made games for the Western market. But we have been in market there for 5 years, and as I'll talk about a little bit further in my talk, we've actually pivoted that presence to focus on doing things specifically for the China market, which is a sign of our kind of evolving strategy and viewpoint. Here are some of our games that you may be familiar with. Our most recent one in market, the Marvel Contest of Champions game, reached the $100 million mark in under 8 months, which was a tremendous feat for us, and we're super proud of that. Over 48 million people worldwide have downloaded the game, and still going strong, so that's super. And we also have a game coming out this Thursday, which we're super excited about, Star Wars Uprising. So you'll notice a little bit of a pattern in that last slide in this one, which is the leaning into licensed IP, which we've all heard about the increasing importance of that, so I won't belabor that point too much, but in this age of growing CPI, it definitely does help. So now I'll get into the fun part of my presentation. I love to use clip art, so hopefully you guys are not offended by that. Think local. So what do I mean by that? So it's one thing to think about your company and the industry from a global perspective, but what we've been finding is that as you go out beyond your core territory, your core markets, into other regions, into China, into Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, etc., it's important to not only understand the opportunities in those markets, but it's also just as important to understand the differences between and among those various markets, which is where the local aspect of this new word comes in. We all know that the markets, using the Asian territories, which collectively account for over 50% of the global gaming revenue in mobile today, just Japan, Korea, and China alone do that. There is more differences between and among those three territories than there are similarities, and it's very, very important to understand what those differences are if you have any intention of trying to create commercial success for yourself in those territories. You can do that yourself, subject to resource constraints. You can do that through partners. It's all a very personal and subjective choice in how you get there, but acknowledging that there are differences and getting smart about them and figuring out whether and how and when to implement them into your game, super important. So another wise man that we all know very well is going to give us a little spoiler alert, which is the stuff is hard. The shit is hard. It's not easy. It takes a lot of work, takes a lot of perseverance, takes a lot of time, but ultimately you hope that the payoff is great. So that begs the question, why is it so hard? So my team and I put together some handy charts here that hopefully you guys will find useful that talks about the extent to which games have historically done great jobs in other markets. And so what you'll see here is that we picked the 4 markets that I'm talking about, the 3 Asian markets plus the US, and you'll see where the revenue comes from, right? So you can see in virtually every case, the top performing game comes from, the top performing games come from in market. So you look at Japan, 92% of the top performing games have historically come from Japanese developers, 2% from China. You would think China, being closer in proximity, closer in culture, et cetera, would do better than the United States. You'd think Korea would do much more, but no, Japan turns out is historically been an insular market. Similarly, you'll see that with Korea as well, 72% of revenue comes from their developers. So again, what we see here is that historically this has been a tough nut to crack. But we are all getting smarter, hopefully, again, through our own efforts, through partners, through market intelligence on how to crack this code. And there are indications, too, that many of these markets are becoming more and more open to Western content and vice versa for our Western markets being more open to Eastern content, subject to, in many cases, these games being modified to fit the local tastes. Sorry, I should have done these little things earlier. So, this is another eye chart here that kind of goes further into some data that we accumulated that talks about how these top grossing games around the world rank in the various territories where they appear. So you'll see Monster Strike is a great example, right? We talk about Monster Strike. It's one of the 10 leading revenue generating games of all time, according to a recent industry article. But you look at its performance across the board, that's driven by its success in Japan. Meanwhile, it is 608th ranked by revenue in the United States. It is 228th in Korea and does generally better in China at 59th. And you see a lot of NAs, which means not applicable, where games don't even resonate on from a revenue perspective in certain territories, even though they're considered global successes. So, punchline here, still a big delta of success from country to country, but also I think creates a lot of opportunity to really drive that innovation, that innovative thinking that I alluded to earlier, given the analogy around being in the Industrial Revolution. So for those of you that are here for Dave Helgeson's fireside chat and a lot of the data that you've talked about, many of us have probably seen this eye chart as well that talks about the steep hockey stick of Androids and iOS relative to the consoles. And this was however many quarters after launch, on one axis and millions of users. So a very high ramp, and I would argue that this is indicative of what we saw in that first historical phase of the Renaissance period. And now you're going to see some data from me that indicates that we are in fact, a maturation and saturation point in a lot of the major markets. So using North America, for example, the yellow bars indicate the growing install base from 2012 to what we predict will be in 2018. And the orange line indicates the monetization per device. So we've all seen the data that's come out recently from folks like Flurry, NPD, that talk about some interesting trends. Some would say alarming, some would say concerning, some would say just par for the course of the evolution of a market where we're in, which is, users, I think there was a 37% decrease according to Flurry in the time spent in games from last year to this year, which was very surprising to them. NPD says that on average users spend money in 1.6 games. So what that's telling us is that we have, and CPI costs continue to go up because we're all, in theory, if you believe kind of market theories, the reason why it's going up is because demand is higher than supply and we're going after a finite number of users and not bringing on any net new users like we were in the early days of mobile. So here we're saying that, going into 2018, that the actual monetization per device is going to actually level off, even though the user base is expanding. The same is true we see here in this continent. Again, some decent growth on the install base, but some leveling out after 2016 of the monetization per device. And then also in Asia, again, kind of an aggregate number here in terms of the install base, which is very, very attractive. But again, the monetization kind of maturing, which is indicative of a market that in 2014 was much more mature than the Western markets and will continue to operate that way. So, Asia mature, still dominant. Our friend Tim Merrill from Digit Capital likes to put these fancy pie charts out that are very, very helpful because it really shows in clear terms how Asia is going to be dominant into the future as a percentage of revenue. I said earlier that the three major markets account for over 50% of the revenues, and this chart indicates that that is going to continue to grow. So the China challenge. So we recently announced for the Marvel Contest of Champions game that we were partnering with a local publisher there by the name of Long2 after a pretty long diligence and assessment period by myself and a handful of other folks, including leadership in our Beijing office, to find the right partner. It was a really eye-opening and really educational experience because it allowed us the opportunity to learn more about the market, learn more about the players, learn more about how the ecosystem operates, and ultimately, you know, needing to find a partner for legal and regulatory reasons in China, right? So we could obviously self-publish on iOS, but the Android ecosystem is currently unavailable to many Western companies going in directly. So. Here's some of the challenges that we found that, in our opinion, were going to be solvable in collaboration with a partner. We obviously have a very fragmented distribution ecosystem with over 200 app stores in that market, which all have their own SDKs for payments, all have their own kind of advertising outlets, et cetera, et cetera. So for an outside company like us, a foreign company, it's really hard to navigate that. Also, you know, so people use words like localization. I like to kind of use the term culturalization because for me, localization is more about changing the language in a game, whereas culturalization is actually creating a different version of your game to fit a specific market. And in fact, that's exactly what we're doing in partnership with our publisher. They are giving us the playbook of their perceived best practices and the changes that need to be made. And we're actually going to end up launching Marvel Contest of Champions in China that looks very different, not from an aesthetic perspective, but from a system design, from a monetization perspective. There are certain features being built in there, like a really aggressive VIP system that is really unique to China. So it's going to look and feel materially different from you know, kind of a back office perspective, if you will. The aesthetic of it being a fighting game with superheroes is still going to stay the same, but these would not have been readily apparent for us and would have ensured that the game as it is in our home markets would not have been successful in China but for these changes. So we're hoping as it launches later this year, early next year, that we'll actually see the fruit of that labor. We all know the issues with intellectual property. We actually made a decision, as I alluded to earlier, that we're taking a portion of our Beijing studio and reorienting them toward being our in-house culturalization shop. And what that means is they will actually do all the work that our publisher gives us recommendations on to culturalize the game and make it ready for the Chinese market. The benefit there is that we get to keep control of the code. We don't have to hand it over to a partner, which I know is a point of a lot of nervousness for many companies going into China based on kind of past history and stories that we've all heard. And it also allows us the opportunity to protect the licensed IP, in this case Marvel being very proprietary, rightly so, around their IP. We want to be, you know, kind of live up to our moral and contractual obligations there to be good brand stewards for them. Also, again, having people on the ground there, either directly or through partners that feed your intelligence, that feed your decision making, that feed your business is really important. You know, doing this from afar is very challenging. So whether it's partnering up with somebody, finding you know, one or more folks on the ground, either part-time or full-time, to really understand the market, you know, live in that culture, understand what it's like to be a game maker and a game player and a consumer in the market is super important. So as I alluded to earlier, you know, we've got some focus here on the China market. You know, for us in particular, this first point, I said that the three major markets account for over 50% of the global revenues in mobile gaming. For us, historically, those three markets have accounted for about 10% of our overall revenue, so clearly a big delta. that we saw an opportunity to try and narrow down to be more in line with what the global numbers are. I've been talking about aligning with partners in the region. These are some examples of folks that we have great partnerships with, along to obviously the publisher. Disney has a huge presence for their games business that supports itself and its partners all throughout Asia, which has been extremely helpful for the Marvel game and hopefully for the Star Wars game. And obviously big distribution partners like Tencent and Qihoo. And I mentioned earlier about going native, right? Getting boots on the ground, being really well versed. You know, for us, we have the advantage of having a studio there. One of our co-founders started that studio and has been there for 5 years. So we obviously have a lot of native Chinese employees who are also gamers and consumers in that market that are driving a lot of our market intelligence. So why this approach? You know, earlier this year we articulated a strategy for ourselves that we call fewer, bigger, bolder. And so, you know, historically, as a company in the mobile space, we were putting out 16 to 20 games a year through a combination of our first-party studios as well as a third-party publishing division that I currently manage. And we were seeing a lot of trends in the marketplace that were telling us that, you know, maybe doing more is not the right path, but going with fewer is actually better. And there's some stats that my team put together that actually articulate this point. We charted the historical revenues of games that occupied the top 100 grossing spot, starting from, I believe, 2012. And we saw that going through the beginning of this year, that it generated a 286% increase over that 4-year period, which is a very respectable one. It got up to $1.1 million a month. And, you know, for a lot of folks, that is actually, you know, legitimate monthly revenue, and it actually is. Not unfortunately for a company of our size. And we were seeing that, you know, many of our games were not staying in the top of the charts or making it at the top of the charts, which is where we see the biggest opportunity. As we all know, you know, a lot of the concentration and the oxygen in the room is up at the top of the charts. And this kind of just reiterates the point. We also charted the historical performance of games that occupied the top grossing spot in the App Store, and this is the kind of growth that spot materialized. And most of it, obviously, for Clash of Clans over the last few years, but over 2,200% increase during that same period. So obviously, what that's telling us is there's greater concentration toward the top of the market, and really anchoring on doing fewer, bigger, bolder bets and games, and really going all in on those seems to be what the market is telling us to do. So next question is for us and for you guys and for the industry as a whole, then what? You know, so we've talked about the Asian markets. Where are the areas for growth? And the one that excites me the most, and again, this is my personal opinion and not indicative of anything that we're doing currently in terms of focus or thinking, is India. You know, there are other markets that we can talk about. Latin America is interesting. The EMEA region is interesting, but ultimately, you know, India as a market to me has a lot of the characteristics of what we saw historically from a data perspective and statistical perspective in China. So here's some statistics at a high level. Thank you to our friend Mary Meeker, who's a wonderful venture capitalist in the States that does a really great annual report called The State of the Internet. You guys should look it up on SlideShare or anywhere else on the web if you haven't seen it already. It's chock full of hundreds of pages and slides of great data. Some top 3 points here about the Indian market you can read. You know, they're onboarding new internet users at a tremendous pace. A lot of innovation happening on the infrastructure side in terms of 3G to 4G. A lot of handset manufacturers in that region are trying to get a foothold as smartphones become more of the norm there. And current app usage we're already seeing is skewing toward messaging and games. So obviously a lot of the messaging applications in that part of the world actually are feeders for games and for connecting consumers to games. And the good news is that when you see 2 of the games here are Western games, right, from Western developers. We've got Subway Surfer and Candy Crush. You don't see any games here yet from Japan, Korea, or China, which you would think, again, given their proximity, given their influence over the handsets that are coming there from those markets into India, that there'd be a lot more of that. Facebook, very big, so obviously that you know, is a good sign. WhatsApp, obviously, you know, is part of that ecosystem, so that's great as well. Messenger also, so, you know, we're really excited about some of the early trends that we see. And that is it for me. Thank you guys so much for listening.